Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. My guest today is Robert Whitaker, and he wrote a very amazing book that I hope you will read if you haven't read it. It came out in 2010. It's called Anatomy of an Epidemic, and all the doctors with whom I work and admire, like Dr. John McDougall, Dr. Alan Goldhammer, and Dr. Doug Lyle, they recommend this book to all of their patients, especially if they are considered going on to psychiatric medicine. Please welcome Robert Whitaker to the show. It's very nice to meet you, and your book was incredible.
Oh, that's nice. It's a pleasure to be here, AJ, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
Oh, it's just really quite an honor. I love that I live in a world that I can read a book and actually ask the author questions. It's sort of like a personal book club. But in case some of my audience is unfamiliar with your work, Robert, what made you decide to write this book, and who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, so for the longest time, I was a journalist, a newspaper journalist, writing for newspapers. I was covering medicine and science. And then I did take a brief detour in the 90s. I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School, where we were really schooled in evidence-based medicine. And then what happened was and I continued to freelance, write for newspapers, that sort of thing. And in 1998, I wrote a series for the Boston Globe on basically abuse of patients in psychiatric research settings. And that set off writing about psychiatry for this reason. While I was doing that research, I found that outcomes for schizophrenia patients in the US and 6 other rich countries were much worse than in 3 developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria. And the World Health Organization did 2 such studies. And each time they concluded that living in a developed country like the United States is a strong predictor you won't recover. And that was the first sort of stunning thing. Then the second stunning thing was I came upon a study done by Harvard Medical School researchers. And they said outcomes for schizophrenia had actually declined in the United States in the past 30 years and were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. Now, here's why this was so stunning for me and what launched me to write about this. And then I'll tell about how I made it to Anatomy of an Epidemic. Is when I was writing about this story was how we were making all these great advances in understanding the biology of schizophrenia. We had these new drugs that were so great, and it was this story of progress. And then all of a sudden, I was coming upon research that told something quite different. Rather than progress, actually sort of deterioration. And then here was the kicker. My understanding at this time, this was 1998, a long time ago, was that antipsychotics were absolutely essential for people diagnosed with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. And yet in these World Health Organization studies, the outcomes were by far the best where they used the drugs acutely, but not chronically. So in India and Nigeria, which had the best outcomes, they only kept people on for a short period of time. So right away, there was a conventional narrative, and now I saw there must be another narrative to discover out there. And I wrote a book about that called Mad in America, and that came out in 2010, which really was very much a narrative that undercut our conventional narrative of progress. And then I wrote a couple other books, and then people started saying, like, well, why do we have so many children on meds these days? Why are so many people with bipolar? Why are so many people on, seemingly struggling with mental illness these days and going on disability? So that led me to write a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And this was in 2010. And here's what I did. I went back to 1987. That was the year that Prozac came on the market. And Prozac was said to be a drug that made us better than well, this great breakthrough. And we got other SSRI antidepressants said to be so great. And they were said to fix a chemical imbalance in the brain. And then we got new antipsychotics. They fixed the chemical imbalance in the brain. So the first thing I did was this. Since 1987, since the conventional narrative was we had discovered the chemicals that cause mental disorders, and now we had drugs that fix them. And that's a story that tells of great progress. And generally, when you have great medical progress, you can expect the burden of that illness to go down in society, right? So I just looked at the number of adults on disability from 1987 to 2008. And here's what the numbers were. In 1987, there were 1.25 million American adults on disability due to mental illness. By 2008, it was around 4 million people. So that was more than a tripling of people on disability during this 20-year period. Now, that doesn't tell of progress. That tells you something going wrong. Children, the number of children on disability soared as well. So the first thing I could see was, as we've adopted widespread use of these drugs, by the way, spending on psychiatric drugs went from $800 million in 1987 to $40 billion, 50-fold increase in 2008. Anyway, as we've been getting more people diagnosed, more people treated with drugs, we're having this explosion in disability. And then I raised this question, and this is why the book has gotten a lot of attention and, has stayed current for, 11, 12 years now. I asked this question: how do psychiatric drugs affect people in the long term? Because, we test drugs to see if they knock down, quote, the symptoms of the disorder better than placebo over a 6-week period. But people are on these drugs for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so I asked, what does research, what does science tell us about the long-term impact of antidepressants, antipsychotics, benzodiazepine, mood stabilizers? And I also asked this as part of the question, not just on the symptoms, but how about functioning? How about social lives? How about the ability to work and have a meaningful life? Does science tell us that this paradigm of care provides that benefit to people? It helps them live full lives, helps them get past their difficulties. And what I found in the nutshell is, over and over again, in all sorts of research, actually stretching back to the 1950s, is these drugs, while they may provide some relief over the short term, and they do a couple things over the long term. They increase the chronicity of the disorders. That's one. You're more likely still to be symptomatic years later. Number two, you're more likely to be functional impaired. You're more likely not to be working, or having other difficulties in life. And three, many people move from a mild disorder, like say a mild bout of anxiety or mild depressive episode, and become chronically ill, or they move to a more severe diagnosis like depression to bipolar. And what was really stunning about this is, you see this with antipsychotics, you see it with benzodiazepines, you see it with long-term use of antidepressants, and you actually see in the research. So these drugs, psychiatric drugs, came in the 1950s, okay? What we remember as the first psychiatric drugs. You see in the research literature by the 1970s, researchers are saying this, and clinicians: oh, my patients are getting better faster now, but they're relapsing more frequently than they used to. It seems that these drugs are causing a chronification of the disease. And these were not critics. These were mainstream NIMH researchers. And they also then concluded that they found the biological reason for why these drugs, what they do to the brain, how they change the brain, cause this chronification. So it's there in the research literature. It's obviously of something of great importance. If you go on a psychiatric drug, you don't want to just know what's going to happen in 6 weeks, what's going to happen to you in 1 year, 2 years. How's it going to impact your life? And people haven't been told this, including prescribers. And that's why the book is, and the reason the book has had staying power is because it's their research. When I say their, I mean mainstream biological psychiatry, the people who believed in the drugs. It's their research that is telling this story. And it's funded by the NIMH, World Health Organization, all mainstream. So it doesn't come from the critics, so to speak. There's always been a lot of criticism of diagnoses, et cetera. I ask this question: even if your diagnosis, let's pretend your diagnoses are good, how does it affect people so diagnosed? And what does your research say? And that's why it's what their research says. And the book has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of citations.
You must have spent a lot of time researching this book.
Well, in a way, it started all the way back in 1998 when I was doing research for Mad in America. And then I did write another, after that book was published in 2002, I did write another couple books outside of psychiatry, but I went back to it probably in 2007 and really worked on it pretty hard for a good another 2 years. So yeah, I spent a lot of time in the library and all digging through the research literature.
Why are you so interested in this topic? Were you touched by this in any way? Any friends or family members that dealt with this?
Well, this is an interesting story. I mean, sure, everyone knows somebody who's struggled with psychiatric difficulties or mental difficulties, and I'm not any different. But that wasn't what motivated me at all. Really, what the trigger for me was very simply the World Health Organization studies in 1998, where they said living in a developed country is a strong predictor you won't recover if you're diagnosed. And I thought, what a tragedy that is. But then also I became immediately interested because I was a believer. I had worked at, I'd covered medicine a long time. I was covering medicine for a newspaper when they talked about, we've discovered that that depression is due to too little serotonin, and these drugs fix that, which is a great advance. I was at Harvard Medical School for a while, and we also were hearing, even at that time, all these advances in psychiatry. These new drugs, antipsychotics, are great. Atypicals are called. And then I come upon these studies by the World Health Organization and say, that narrative isn't true. So I was, of course, really curious to see, well, how come we have this one narrative and these other people, the World Health Organization is finding something very different? But then the real reason I became so motivated is because if indeed that conventional narrative of great progress, of fixing chemical imbalances in the brain, I'll talk about that in just a second. If it's not true, think about the impact that it's having on people's lives, the decisions they make as they go forward. So it was obviously an important story too, to find out is, in some ways, have we fooled ourselves? Have we been told a false narrative that is having such an impact on our society and individual lives? And of course, on kids' lives, we've started medicating kids. So that's what motivated me. I will say, it was funny, after I wrote Mad in America, I learned of some, people closer to me in my family that had some difficulties, but I never knew about it. They just came out after I wrote that first book. And the other thing I will say this is, very early on, when I was deciding to maybe write Mad in America, the first book, the first thing I did was, I had written this series for the Boston Globe. Everybody told me antipsychotics are like insulin for diabetes. That's why people have to take them forever. They correct the chemical imbalance in the brain, okay? Then I called up some survivor groups. Survivor groups are people who've been in mental hospitals and not particularly appreciating the care. And I said, well, what about this chemical imbalance story? And they said, well, all we know is we take these drugs and they make us feel miserable, talking about antipsychotics. So I went back to some of these really well-known doctors, psychiatrists, and I said, listen, I want to know more about the chemical imbalance story. Can you please tell me where you found that people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine? Because that's the dopamine hyperactivity theory of schizophrenia. And here's what they told me. Ready? Well, we didn't actually find that. I said, what do you mean you didn't find that? And they said, well, we didn't actually ever find that people with schizophrenia have overactive dopamine systems. I said, okay, well, why do you say that then? And they said this. Well, the drugs block dopamine, antipsychotics. We know they're helpful, so we tell people they have a low dopamine hyperactivity, so they'll take their drugs. And I thought to myself, you're knowingly misleading patients, saying you have a known brain malfunction with your chemistry and your neurotransmitter, just so they'll take the drugs. And I thought, wow, you don't do this to other patients. You don't tell other patients that they have something wrong when you don't know that to be true. So that was a real motivating factor too, to find out, well, why does psychiatry tell this story about chemical imbalances when it's not true? And that was to me, it was a sense of betrayal.
Do they still do they still believe in the chemical imbalance hypothesis?
You know, this is an amazing story. In their own literature in 1992, a man named John Kane, who's a well-known researcher, schizophrenia researcher, said the dopamine hyperactivity theory of schizophrenia is no longer credible. That's 1992. In 1998, well, and then let's go to the low serotonin theory of depression. As early as 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health saying, we're just not finding this pathology in depressed patients. There was lots of more research done in the late 1980s to see if depressed patients had low serotonin. And in 1988, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook says the low serotonin theory is dead. We just didn't find it. That's their own textbook. A guy by the name of Kenneth Kindler in 2004 said, and he's a famous researcher on chemical imbalances. He said, we've hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for mental disorders and have not found them. So American Psychiatric Association was telling the public on its website and educational brochures that mental disorders are due to chemical imbalances. But behind the curtain, they were saying, we haven't found this. And now what you'll find researchers say, like Ronald Pies is a former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, which is like the trade journal of the American Psychiatric Association. He said, the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders is a kind of myth, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. In a way, he's right, because it really was abandoned long ago, or at least seen as like, we're not finding it. But he's trying to say we never said it, but in fact, they did say it. And then they said it on their website, and they did as they were still saying as recently as like 2015, 2016, on the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook, that depression was probably due to low serotonin. That was 18 years after their textbook said, we just haven't found it to be true.
But yet oftentimes these drugs are still the first line of treatment. And, I understand, like psychiatrists, they prescribe these drugs, but I can't tell you how many people go to a 5-minute visit with a nurse practitioner, and the first thing they want to do is give them a script.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Nowadays, I think something like 85% of psychiatric drugs are not prescribed by psychiatrists. They're prescribed by, as you say, nurse practitioners and general practitioners. They have no clue what these drugs do and how the brain changes in response to the drug. And so someone comes to a nurse practitioner or comes to a GP and says, oh, I'm a little depressed, I'm a little anxious. They just get out the script. They have no idea that drug's going to change that person's brain. If they're on it for a longer period of time, they're going to have trouble getting off. And I guarantee they have no idea about the long-term impact. And actually, listen, psychiatrists, in my opinion, are all over the map with their use of drugs. But a lot of them, I think, a number of them, especially younger ones, trying to rethink their use of these drugs because they see that their patients aren't getting better, especially long term. They just keep coming back with new problems, and then they add, next thing you know, a person's on 2 drugs, 3 drugs, 4 drugs, 5 drugs.
That's what I wanted to say. And here I'm not a doctor, obviously. I'm a person who was a patient with an experience that is uniquely my own. But I'm thinking, if these drugs really work, why do they keep having to add another drug? Like, you see these television commercials, which, by the way, like, why are they even advertising psychiatric medication on television? I wonder. But they say, well, if such and such a drug didn't work, consider adding this new one to this one, and then it will work.
Yeah, that's the great question. If these drugs are so effective, you should be able to go on one and stay on one, and that would be great, right? But what happens is they stop working, or you start getting new symptoms, and next thing you know, someone's on 3, 4 drugs, and at that point, 5 drugs, 6 drugs. You're in trouble if you're on 6 psychiatric drugs. Trust me. You're going to have all sorts of physical problems, physiology problems, and it's just hell to unwind that. But that's exactly right. And one of the funny things about advertisements is, for a long time we heard how great the SSRIs were. This is in the 1990s. This is Prozac, and then SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So for the longest time, we heard how great these drugs were, right? And then all of a sudden, they came out with the atypical antipsychotics and drugs like Abilify and these other drugs. And now all of a sudden, the ad said this: antidepressants don't work for 50% of people. So if it's not working for you, take Abilify. And I wanted to say is, I don't remember any ads on TV saying the drugs only don't work for 50% of the people. But all of a sudden, when they were trying to market a different drug, they started, confessing that, well, these antidepressants really don't work so well.
Well, sometimes placebos work just as well. I remember that from your book.
Well, yeah, literally, even over the short term, placebos almost work as well. And you have to understand that. So I think when Irving Kirsch did his study of how much of the response is like a placebo response, he says placebos give about 85% of the benefit over the short term that the drugs do. And here was what he was saying is that there's something called the Hamilton scale for measuring symptoms. And for something to be clinically meaningful, it was supposed to be, I think you were supposed to have 7-point difference between placebo and, no, 3-point difference, between placebo and drug. But in the trials, it was only like 1.8, 2 point, which isn't even clinically observable. It just comes out statistically. But here's the other thing. When the drug companies do their short-term trials, they cherry pick patients that are supposed to be most likely to respond to the drug. And with the SSRIs, for example, when they did trials in real-world patients, they did something called the STAR-D trial. This was done starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And it was funded by the NIMH. And it was going to say, it wasn't placebo-controlled. They just said, this is going to show us how these drugs work over a long period of time and in real-world conditions where we can switch from one drug to the other. Well, there were 4,041 patients who entered that trial. Only 38% ever saw their symptoms remit to where they really weren't at least mildly depressed for as long as a day. And at the end of 1 year, you know how many people were well in that trial?
None.
108.
Okay.
3%. Now, here's the interesting thing you say about placebo. At the same time, the NIMH was doing another study to see, well, what is the long-term course or the one-year outcome for unmedicated people? And here's what they found. That if you didn't medicate people, after 4 weeks, yeah, maybe not as many were doing well as with the medicated people. But what they found is in the unmedicated group, they kept getting better. More and more people remitted, such that by the end of 1 year, 85% were in remission. So with the drug paradigm, we had 3% in remission at the end of 1 year. With this unmedicated cohort, it was 85%. And the researcher who came up with the 85% funding, it was NIMH funded. NIMH is the National Institute of Mental Health. He said, wow, it'd be really hard to do any better than this for any drug treatment to beat this outcome. And that was always understood to be the longer term outcome of depression, that you'd have a time of depression. And at the end of 1 year, something like 85% would be basically okay. And now people, there was another long-term study in real world patients. I think 6% were well at the end of 1 year. But here's the problem. These poor results are never announced to the public because psychiatry can't come out and say, listen, our drugs, hardly anyone's getting better. The drug companies aren't going to say it. So this sort of information, even though this comes from NIMH funded trials, it just isn't communicated to people. And that's part of the tragedy.
How do you feel, though, that the fact that they market them on television, these drugs?
Well, I think it's only us and one other country. I think, and I'm not even sure New Zealand still allows it. It's a terrible idea. Because basically, look what you saw on the ads for these drugs. And it started after Prozac came to market. What would you see? You'd always see sometimes you'd see a bouncing ball smiling and stuff like that.
I was going to say, it makes you want to take Zoloft. You see these happy faces.
Happy faces. And then you usually see very pretty people walking hand in hand on a beach, or they're all like at a picnic or something. Everybody's happy and they're gorgeous people. And it's like, you too, if you just take this pill, can be, having a great life. And then even while they still show the person's, walking hand in hand on the beach and in love and all that, they list all the side effects really fast. And one of the side effects is actually sexual dysfunction with antidepressants. So the irony is, here they're showing you a picture on TV of people like just so happy and finding love and blah, blah, blah. And one of the side effects is sexual dysfunction. So the problem is the TV is a way to generate actually demand. In other words, patients now say, oh, I want to feel like that. They go to their doctor, that nurse practitioner, they go to their GP and say, I want an antidepressant. And the prescriber feels pressured to prescribe the drug. And plus, of course, there's all these continuing education dinners where they take the doctors out, to nice meals and give them free samples to hand out. So there's this whole mechanism for selling drugs that begins with, TV ads and all.
I heard you on a podcast talking about post-SSRI sexual dysfunction where it was forever.
Yeah, this is unbelievably sad. When I finished Anatomy of an Epidemic, a magazine called me up and said, what do you want to write about? I said, I want to write about PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And the editor says, what is that? I've never heard of it. And I said, well, a lot of people are complaining that they go on these drugs and then they come off. They go on these drugs, they lose their sexual interests and they become, have some sort of sexual dysfunction. They go off with the intention of getting their sexual function back, but they don't. And the guy said, wow, that's interesting. I said, but I'll report it for you, but you'll never run the study because I've looked at your magazine and you're funded by drug companies. He goes, oh no, we have this wall between the publishing angle and the editorial side. Okay, I'll do it. Anyway, it is particularly pronounced with people who are medicated as teenagers. And it also showed up, what happened is we started medicating teenagers in the 1990s with SSRIs. Then they go to college and there's a lot of sexual activity at college. So what do they want? They want to go off their drugs and get, and partake. And what they began to notice was, and this started out, there was a clinic at University of Iowa that first noticed this, the kids would go off and say, but I still don't have my sexual interest back. And by the way, it's not just physical. There is it's as much as anything, it's emotional. I don't care. I see a beautiful woman or I see a beautiful man. I don't care. I see a rainbow. I don't care. And it's like a lack of passion. And, I interviewed a number of people who had happened this to them who were devastated. And some of them had been 4, 5, 6, 7 years and had never gotten their sexual function back. But it's more than that. They have this sort of
Tardive dyskinesia?
Well, no, it's a tardive dysphoria.
Dysphoria.
Which is I just don't care about anything. I just can't mount an emotional response to anything. Now, they were doing some animal research on this, and sure enough, it happens in rats, for example. Even after you take them off, they don't mount other rats as much, so you see the sexual dysfunction. And here's the biology is actually not known, okay? But here's one thought. So if you go on an SSRI, it blocks the normal reuptake of serotonin from that synaptic cleft. And I presume most of your listeners know how neurons communicate, but you have a presynaptic neuron that releases that chemical into that tiny gap, which we call the synaptic cleft. It binds with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And then that's the messaging system. And then the messaging has to end very crisply. And so the serotonin goes back up into the presynaptic neuron. Normally, what an SSRI does, it blocks that reuptake process, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Serotonin stays in the synaptic cleft longer than normal. That's upping serotonergic activity. Now, what does your brain do in response? Well, your brain has all these feedback loops that are designed to maintain what was called a homeostatic equilibrium, a normal functioning of your serotonergic system. So what it does is this: your presynaptic neurons start putting out less serotonin than normal, and your postsynaptic neurons decrease their density of receptors for serotonin. So by going on an SSRI, you drive your body into a suboptimal serotonergic state, a deficient state, actually, physiology. Again, here's the metaphor. The drug acts as an accelerator, your brain puts down the brake on your serotonergic activity. Okay, now you go off the drug. Does your serotonergic system renormalize? Well, in animal studies, it doesn't often. And there's some other evidence from human studies it sometimes doesn't renormalize. And that is hypothesized to be one reason for the sexual dysfunction, is that you're, especially if you've been on these drugs for a long time, you've driven your brain into this subserotonergic state, doesn't renormalize, and that's why you have this ongoing problem. And it seems to affect about 25% of people, especially if they've been on drugs a longer period of time, and if they took the drugs starting in puberty. I mean, that's the most disheartening. You talk to these people who went on the drugs when they were 15 and now they're 25, 28, they're just, devastated by this. But I will say this, that's a hypothesis as to that's the mechanism that causes this. It's probably more complex than that, because you're altering your serotonin system. And the serotonin system is an incredibly complex system. It's throughout your, it goes into your gut and all. It's one of the earlier evolved neurotransmitter systems. So you're really, when you go on this drug and stay on it for a long time, you're really mucking up a primary system in our bodies, in our brain.
Whether psych meds are good or not, what about the efficacy in them being prescribed to children, young children?
Well, I think that's criminal. So let's just start with antidepressants. Those studies failed in kids. They did not even beat placebo over the short term. So why would you be given a drug to kids that didn't even beat placebo over the short term, increases the risk of suicide in kids, going to cause sexual dysfunction? Why would you do that? And they're going to have trouble coming off. There's just no evidence base for it with the antidepressants. I think David Healy's looked at that. He's a Welsh psychiatrist. He says there's been like 35 studies, and they're all negative for antidepressants in kids. There were some ones that said Prozac was different, but those were just spun in a different way to make Prozac look better. So that's that. Antipsychotics cause all sorts of bodily problems. They cause metabolic dysfunction. They shrink your brain over time. They too can cause cognitive function. They can cause emotional slowing, cognitive slowing. So why would you do that to a kid? And by the way, they did a NIMH-funded study of kids diagnosed with psychotic disorders. I think it was an 18-month study. They concluded at the end, few kids benefit from antipsychotics. They couldn't stay on the drugs. They worsened on the drugs. Stimulants, of course, are given for ADHD. The long-term study that was done to assess, are we helping kids with stimulants? It's called the MTA study. I forget what MTA is, multimodal. I forget what it stands for, but it was mounted in the 1990s. Now, after 10 months, the kids randomized to stimulants and treated by an expert were doing a little bit better in terms of reduction of ADHD symptoms and on a reading test than the behavioral kids treated with behavioral care. Okay. And that was, even today, that study is cited. See, this proves that the drugs provide a long-term benefit. Okay. You can still go on websites and see this study cited as evidence that the drugs provide a benefit, longer-term benefit. However, that study didn't end after 10 months. It continued. Or was it? It might have been 14 months. I'm sorry. I sometimes get it. It might have been 14 months, not 10 months. I think it was. At the end of 3 years, though, here's what the researchers found. Because after the 14-month period, people were free to stay on the drugs or go off, or vice versa, right? At the end of 3 years, being on drug was a marker not of benefit, but of deterioration. That was their words, okay? And also they were now a little bit suppression of growth. At the end of 6 years, those who stayed on drugs had worse ADHD symptoms, worse delinquency rates, more cognitive impairment, functional impairment. As one of the researchers said, a psychologist, he said, we had thought and hoped that those that stayed on drugs would have better outcomes, but we did not find that to be so. We did not find a benefit on any domain of functioning long-term. But that's never cited. If you go to websites directed at parents, they cite the 14-month results, not the 3-year results, not the 6-year results, not the 8-year results. And they even have like 10-year results. The kids that were medicated had some growth suppression, no benefit on any domain of functioning. So you asked me, what do I think about medicating kids? Well, it's clearly a commercial enterprise. Antidepressants weren't effective even over the short term, cause all sorts of side effects. Antipsychotics cause metabolic dysfunction, weight gain, cognitive slowing. They actually do cause a little bit of shrinkage of the brain. So why do you give kids that if it's going to make them ill? And the one study they did at longer term, kids were not doing well at the end of whatever month it was, 18 months, I guess. Benzos we know are terrible long term. And stimulant, the large study didn't find a benefit. So I'll ask you, AJ, given that that's research, why are we medicating kids?
I have no idea, because to me, if suicide is a potential side effect, I don't know if we should be medicating anyone. And I think you said in a podcast once that the kids that were medicated early showed early signs of dementia.
Well, not the kids. Well, they showed some. The kids who were medicated earlier with antipsychotics showed some signs of tardive dyskinesia. That's not exactly dementia, but that's, tardive dyskinesia is a sign of brain dysfunction. And actually, if you look at tardive dyskinesia in adults, it is associated with early dementia and cognitive decline. But I will tell you this, people are very worried that if you're medicating kids at age 10, how well are they going to be functioning at age 40, 45, 50? Are you going to be seeing a lot of early dementia in when you start medicating kids early? And remember, the brain continues to develop. Our frontal lobes aren't even developed. And these drugs all perturb that normal development. There's like throwing a wrench into how neurotransmitter pathways operate. I honestly think it's one day we're going to realize this is one of the most tragic things we've done. And by the way, look at our kids today. It's not like the kids today are doing better than they used to. It's something like 50%, 25% of kids now arrive on campus with a prescription and a diagnosis. Second, the campus now is awash in psychiatric drugs, benzos, stimulants, et cetera. It's an incredible drug culture. At some schools, more than 50% now access mental health services during their time in college, more than 50%. And what you see, all the markers of mental health in kids has deteriorated as we've adopted this paradigm of care. So what we're seeing is a paradigm of care that diagnoses kids, makes them think there's something wrong with them, and makes them think that if they hit these like stumbling blocks that we all hit as kids, by the way, it's not easy growing up. You have emotions going every which way. And are they moving into adulthood fluidly? So many are not anymore. And I talk a lot to kids who are diagnosed as kids and medicated, and they're bitter. Many of them are extremely bitter, like they had their childhood taken from them, their early adulthood taken from them. So
how do we help people?
Well, one way is to make this information known. And I do want to say, I'm not, if these drugs helped everybody, I'd say fantastic. You know what I mean?
Do they help people? Are there people whose lives have been saved and improved by these drugs?
Okay, one, I think it is important to say what we're talking about is outcomes in the aggregate, okay? And also outcomes against the background of what are natural recovery rates, okay? So just to make this clear, let's say you have some disorder that actually on drug, 50% do well, okay? And 50% remain symptomatic or worsen. You're the doctor, you say, look, well, at least half my patients do well, all right? And those people will speak up and say, oh, the drugs are really helping. But when you talk about outcomes in the aggregate, what happens if in the nature, 80% recover and only 20% become chronically ill? So with drug, it's 50% recover. I'm just saying this hypothetically, and 50% become chronically ill. You think, okay, that's not bad. But then you go look in nature. In nature, 80% recover, 20% become chronically ill. That's what we mean by worsening outcomes in the aggregate. You've knocked the recovery rate from 80% to 50%. Now, personally, I haven't seen data that shows any recovery rate at 50% long term, okay? That was just a hypothetical. But what do? One, we try to make this research known, and we try to make it known to society. You think it's a little thing to go on an antidepressant, antipsychotic. Well, it's not, because those drugs are going to change your brain. And if you stay on it longer, it's going to be hard to come off. And you risk going into this pitfall of having 3 drugs, 4 drugs, 5 drugs, 6 drugs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to make known research into alternatives that shows that people do well in other ways. Like there's a lot of things showing that if you treat kids in different environments, nurturing environments, stimulating environments, ADHD tends to disappear. And so, in Anatomy of an Epidemic, there's a solution section that looks at alternative ways of dealing with psychosis, depression, really disturbed kids that change the environment all. Even in research studies are showing to provide better outcomes. And so what I did personally also when this book came out, Anatomy of an Epidemic in 2010, is I set up a web magazine called Mad in America. And we get something like 400,000 visitors a month. And what we do on the website is we try to make the science known, science that tells of some of the harms that come from drug treatments, but also science that tells of environmental types of therapy that are producing good outcomes. We also have people write personal stories of that, so people can see like, oh, I was put on drugs when I was 8 and messed me up and that sort of thing. So drug companies amplify the voices of those that are going to sing well of the drugs. We try to provide a stage for those who feel they've been harmed by the drugs to tell their stories. And then we have people blogging about, what they think they can do to better things, that sort of things, in terms of diagnosis. Do we need to get away of diagnosis? So the website's mission is this. It's called Mad in America. The current paradigm of care has failed, and all the data shows that to be so. So we clearly need to rethink and create a new narrative about what goes wrong with people and how they can get better and pathways to recovery, that sort of thing. And part of the philosophy of Mad in America is we don't have the answer. Society needs to do the rethinking. Caring for each other, caring for the quote, people who are struggling, that's a societal responsibility. We need to care for each other and come up with ways, whether it be residential care, access to exercise, access to diet, a lot of different ways that can be pathways to recovery, helping people become involved in volunteer activities, that sort of thing. Anyway, this website I run, Mad in America, it does begin with the starting point. The current paradigm of care has failed. And now the question is, what do we as a society do? How do we set this along a different path? So that's what I've done.
Are you familiar with Michael Moss, who wrote Salt, Sugar, and Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us?
I do know the book. I haven't read the book, but I know of the book, and it sounds so true because
Right.
they process these foods to get our little sugar to trigger over and over again, right?
Well, the reason I bring him up, because to me, in a way, he was sort of like a whistleblower. He blew the lid off the processed food industry, and it seems like you sort of did the same thing with the psychiatric drug industry. And I'm wondering, did you have any backlash from either drug companies or psychiatrists when your book came out, or even today?
Oh, sure. I mean, you don't challenge or undercut a narrative that produces billions of dollars of profits without getting it, making some people unhappy, both within the drug companies and also the profession. I mean, psychiatry's product has become drugs, right? They're psychopharmacologists, and this is threatening their whole livelihood and their narrative and their belief system. I mean, it was nasty when the book came out, to be honest with you. I got attacked in different ways, a lot of sort of personal attacks. One of the first ones was a review by a doctor who said, he likened me to an AIDS denier, a dictator in South Africa who was an AIDS denier, and by virtue of being an AIDS denier, had caused hundreds of thousands of people to die, and that's what this book will do. So that wasn't nice. And then, you get charged with all sorts of things. But here's what's important, AJ. It's 12 years. And yeah, I've been criticized. I've been attacked. I haven't had anyone say I miscited. There was one study people said I miscited out of the hundreds I did. And here's what's interesting. Those researchers said, oh no, he got it right. It's a study by Harrow and Job. So what I take comfort in is the book has really held up, and there has not been showing where I failed in sort of my reporting on this research literature.
So no death threats?
Well, not really.
Okay.
Not serious ones. I've had some calls, some emails, but those were sort of crank shit. Sorry, crank stuff. No, you know what? I mean, the drug companies basically, I actually got more trouble from the drug companies with my first book, but the drug company said, we're so powerful, we can just ignore this stuff. And I think people, you mentioned the book about, salt and fats and all, and that. I think people more intuitively could understand, yeah, this food isn't good for us, okay? And yeah, they're selling us crap food, potato chips, soda, etc. Drugs, it's harder to wrap your mind around prescribed drugs because you think, oh, medications are good. The FDA has said they're good. So in a way, it is like that. But in some ways, it's harder to challenge something medically than even like to challenge the food we eat.
Absolutely. If you were writing the book today, is there anything you would write differently or add?
What a great question. That's a great question. Maybe I would just, there have been second editions, and third editions. And what happened in those editions, that was a chance to update the research. And interestingly, all the updated research just fit into this chronicity story. Of course, whenever you write a book, there are things that you think, oh, I could have done differently. I guess the biggest thing for me would have been maybe I would have spent more time on solutions rather than just one chapter. I might have tried to blow out that section a little bit more. But I guess, I interviewed like 75 people with lived experience for this book. And I really did do an exhaustive sort of dive into the research literature. And I guess the reason I'm not saying jumping on this, oh, I know what I would have done differently, is the book has, if you would have asked me that question in 2010 or 2012, I said, well, the research needs to be, we need more research into long-term outcomes, okay? And maybe we'll get some new stuff that'll sort of disprove some of this. And I actually helped start a foundation to help fund more long-term research. But what has come out since then is all confirming evidence over and over again. So I'm more confident in the story, the book, the narrative that is told here today than I was in 2010. I mean, there's been mainstream people going, yeah, the chemical imbalance story, it didn't pan out. Well, in 2010, they weren't saying that. There's now people saying in the best journals, yeah, you know what? These antipsychotics, we don't have evidence they improve long-term outcomes. They weren't saying that in 2010. There's been a number of studies saying that antidepressants now, they worsen long-term outcomes. They weren't saying that at that time. So I guess it's been a long journey. It's been a lot of criticism. But as you asked me that question today, I actually feel the sense of pride that the book has held up so well, that I haven't been found to have made mistakes, and all the research that's come on since then really has supported the narrative here. And you actually see the mainstream narrative shifting now to accommodate some of this information in there.
What is it about these drugs that make them so difficult for people to get off, particularly the benzodiazepines? Everybody I know that takes benzos, they can never get off them.
Yeah, you know, that showed up actually in the 60s with Librium and Valium. People were having hell time getting off. So why? Why are they so addictive? I will tell you what I understand to be the mechanism of action that was sort of fleshed out by Heather Ashton and what was the psychiatrist's name? I don't know, I'm driving a blank on it. So here's, and you'll see what the problem is here. So benzodiazepine acts on the GABA neurotransmitter. And GABA acts as a brake, okay? So the way your neurotransmitters work, you have some that inhibit activity and some that excite the other neuron. But just as like with driving a car, you need some chemicals that spur activity, and then you need some chemicals that act as a brake, that inhibit that second neuron from firing, okay? Now, GABA is something that acts as a brake on neuronal activity. And so what does a benzodiazepine do? It actually amplifies, it acts as GABA. It amplifies that braking activity. That's why you go on a benzodiazepine, you can go to sleep. It suppresses central nervous system activity. Why you can go on a plane and not feel nervous, because it suppresses the ability to mount an emotional response. It does that by inhibiting, the transmission of neuronal impulses. So you now take a drug that acts as a brake on this GABA system. Okay, it's putting the brake down on a system that acts as a brake. I mean, amplifies the braking system. So what does your brain do with its own actual GABA machinery? It diminishes, because you have this substitute, okay? You have this drug that is acting as the brake, so trying to compensate for that again, it reduces some of its own GABA output, okay? It reduces some of its own receptors for GABA. It's becoming desensitized to GABA. So now you try to come off, right? And now, so you remove the drug that acts on a brake, but you no longer have your normal braking activity. Your GABA system is impaired, okay? So now, as you get along the pathways that try to excite activity, they're not being inhibited. They're not the normal braking on that activity. That's why people all of a sudden feel extremely anxious when they go off, or they feel like things are crawling on their skin, or they can't sleep. And that's because, at least this is the thought, the normal way to break that hyperactivity, that the messaging is gone. So it's like this. Again, let's go back to the car analogy. You have neurons that act like an accelerant, and then you have neurons, or at least chemicals that act as a brake on that activity. Now, in this instance, you put down the brake harder with the drug, slow that activity, but now your own GABA machinery starts to diminish, take away the brake, and now you don't have a brake in all this passage of messages along neurotransmitter systems, and it's like it's running amok. And that's why you feel these weird sensations, you feel this anxiety. It's because this is the thought, you've damaged your own GABA system and it doesn't repair itself. That's the thought.
So is there any hope, and do you have resources? Because there's people watching that are wanting to get off their psychiatric drugs like Zoloft, Cymbalta, and they don't, what do? Do they ask their psychiatrist, their GP? Are there programs that help people get off these drugs?
Well, this is one of the big betrayals as well. They got people on these drugs and they didn't, I'm talking about the medical community, didn't study how to get people off. So one of the things I did along with some others about 6 years ago was start something called the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal to do two things: to develop protocols for helping people get off, and also to research it as well. Like, how do you do this well? And we have a podcast on Mad in America that often talks about this. Here's what seems to be the common wisdom. If you do it slowly enough, sometimes it's going to take a year, and you taper real slowly, there are certainly some people who get off successfully. That's number one. And number two, there's an organization called Mind in the UK that looks at people who've gotten off and follows them for years afterwards. And what they came out with was a sense that you need to heal. Basically, the brain takes time to heal. It's not just that you get the drug out of your system and you get through, whatever withdrawal symptoms are immediate. You actually got to heal your systems, heal your brain off it. And that can take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. But what Mind seemed to find was that after 4 or 5 years, if people could make it there, a lot showed really pretty complete recovery, or at least good recovery. And the other thing is, I also know people who've been on drugs 20 years, got off, and are okay. Sometimes it took them some time. It's so idiosyncratic. By that, I mean, everybody has these individual experiences, which I'm sure are dependent on how long they've been on drugs, how many drugs they were on, what dosages they were on, how they metabolized the drugs. And so all I would say to your listeners is, I know this can be really discouraging to hear this. I mean, and sometimes I hate even talking about it because I don't want to be a bearer of bad news. But there's also good news out of there. And we, on Mad in America, we have all sorts of stories of people who've gotten their lives back after they've gotten off drugs. And yeah, it was hard, but they feel like they were reborn, and they regained their capacity to feel, to love, to think. And so the human being is quite resilient. The brain is resilient. And I think that's the message people need to grab onto, is that hope of resilience.
Would you say that for some people, these drugs are almost like addictive? I mean,
oh no, they are addictive.
Yeah.
Now, they're not in the sense that you crave them, but yeah, the brain has become dependent on them. The brain has adjusted, has gone through what's called a series of compensatory adaptations, trying to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium. Those are the words of neuroscientists, okay, not mine. And that's an addictive process, in the sense that your brain got used to functioning with the presence of the drug. Now, some drugs that release dopamine, they're addictive in the sense you crave them. But addiction is beyond just craving. It's just that your brain has gotten used to it.
Right. So many people I know on psych meds also drink alcohol. And my understanding is that's not a good marriage.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I don't know enough about that, but I will tell you this, that a lot of people who struggle, they'll have what's called co-occurring disorders, a substance abuse disorder with the psychiatric drugs. So that's a pretty good sign that for many people, it's not a good marriage. It's not a good mix. And often I would say the people who are struggling the most often have these they're using drugs or alcohol and the psychiatric drugs. Sometimes I think they're using the alcohol to get away from some of the effects of the psychiatric drugs, but I don't know.
It seems like in some cases, drugs are given to medicate what really is a person's personality.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, some people, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to say this, but if you go back, I'm going to say something. I'll just to show you what you're talking about. If you go back and look at ads for Librium and Valium in the 1960s, you know how they advertise those drugs? Basically, they made it look like, okay, to men, are you coming home and is your wife a bitch? Have her take Valium. That really was the message. And then they would show the woman bringing him his slippers and a drink when he came home and maybe a pipe. So what they were saying when they were marketing was, your wife doesn't have the personality you want her to have. So yeah, obviously, personalities come in. Well, first of all, we can all be irritating to others. I mean, that's the first thing. But personality, first of all, any human being has a lot of different states, emotional states, right? And sometimes we're not so great to be around. That's one thing. But, I know some people sometimes are really difficult. And yeah, people want to medicate them for being difficult. Or sometimes they're anxious. You want to medicate, they'll stop being anxious because your anxiety gets on my anxiety. So, and if someone is sort of like, does struggle with depression now and then, you feel like, oh, it would be nicer if you could just be happy all the time. So yeah, it's personality, it's sort of natural states, it's the fluctuations that we humans experience. And God, we know that growing up as a kid is tough. I mean, your emotions are all over the map. But part of the problem now is with the DSM and the widespread use of drugs is the message is, you're really supposed to be content most of the time and you're not supposed to suffer, but that's just not human beings. And you know what? Being alive is often quite anxiety provoking. There's so many difficulties with just being alive and all. So I think that's one of the problems we have. We have a philosophy of being that says, oh, you're supposed to be content all the time. No, you're not. And you know what my grandmother used to say? She was an immigrant from Germany. She would say something. She would have said this. I mean, she didn't even talk about emotions, but to her, the sense was, if happiness visits now and then, consider yourself fortunate. It's not something that you have all your time.
I love that. I'm going to rewatch this. That's brilliant. So, Robert, people sent in questions in advance, knowing you were going to be on the show. And the first one is from Bonnie. And she says, her son, who is 23, is on Prozac 20 milligrams a day for autism for about 6 years, and he's gained a lot of weight. Could Prozac cause this? And a lot of people were typing in the chat, could these various drugs cause weight gain or make it difficult to lose weight?
Sure, of course. I mean, again, there are a lot of individual responses to these drugs. I mean, they can vary quite a bit, but yeah, antidepressants are known that one of the things they can do is cause weight gain for sure. Antipsychotics are much worse, and one of the things is that does seem to happen with SSRIs is people might slow down a little bit. They're not as active and that sort of thing. But you certainly see that as a possible risk as weight gain.
I'm just curious, like, I'm sure Peter Breggin, and there's other, like I'm sure you've heard of Thomas Saz, other people that are not pro-medication. Has anyone come forward from reading your book that maybe used to believe in the old drug paradigm, that read your book and say, hey, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be giving these drugs as often as we are, especially to younger kids?
Oh yeah, many people came forward, including prescribers in them, because they hadn't seen it. I mean, I was actually asked to give grand rounds at a number of places by psychiatrists who were sort of critical thinking chair departments. And actually, the response by sort of mainstream people, some mainstream people, was such that I got a lot of emails. They wanted to meet with each other, talk about things. And that's how something called the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care was founded, by people who said, why? We need to change what we're doing. And a lot of these were traditional people. And that foundation got started in 2012. They changed their name to Open Excellence, but they funded a lot of research. They funded Bonnie Kaplan's research, part of her research into nutrition. They funded research into non-drug alternatives for for people who are struggling with psychosis, stuff like that.
Yeah. Somebody's typing in the chat that, a lot of times people go on these psych meds because of grief, and grief is a natural phenomenon in life. I mean, like, why do you medicate grief?
Well, yeah, I mean, they keep shortening the time you're allowed to grieve. I think now it's down to 2 weeks. And if you're grieving more than 2 weeks, then maybe you need an antidepressant. I mean, that's just insane. I mean, if you lose someone, I mean, read your Shakespeare, but if you lose someone, let's say a wife, a spouse, a kid, of course you're going to grieve. And in some ways, especially like if you lose a kid, you're never going to be the same. You're going to be grieving the loss of that child the rest of your life, and virtually every day. And, if people who've lost spouses feel this way, and I think there's nothing worse than losing a kid, but so, and now, so of course it's normal. Of course it hurts. I do personally believe that if you're ever going to come out of it, you need to have a grieving process. That's part of like recovering from the loss and finding a way, however difficult, to go forward in life and to often regain a way of loving life again and being able to move forward again. But what do antidepressants do? Well, they sort of numb you, so you actually don't go through that grieving process. And, I forget when, so it went from 6 weeks you could grieve to 4 weeks to now to 2 weeks, I think, in the latest one. So, but I mean, I think that question is really important because grieving does hurt, right? But maybe there's a reason we grieve. You know what I mean? Maybe grieving in its own way is a way to be able to cope with loss and go forward. I don't know. But all I know is that, like, if we want to embrace our humanness, you've got to be able to grieve, and you've got to know that this is probably going to hit you at some point in life.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sheba wrote in, can short-term or one-time off-label use of psychiatric medications such as fluvoxamine for COVID-19 or antidepressants for nerve pain cause the kind of problems you describe in Anatomy of an Epidemic?
Well, what I was looking at Anatomy of an Epidemic was longer-term use, which usually starts to be like 6 months and beyond. And I think there is a lot of evidence that if you're on one dose, one drug, shorter period of time, that the brain will readapt and renormalize, and it won't be as hard getting off. I mean, benzos can be hard to coming off after like 4 weeks and all. But yeah, I mean, well, first of all, one-time use is fine. Okay, one-time use is no problem. And even like if you did like one-time use now and then, it'd be fine. Okay, like let's say you hate flying, you're scared of flying, and you fly once a month. If you need to take a benzo, in my opinion, to get on that airplane, that's probably fine. It's just daily use, day after day after day, month after month, and increasing doses that really, I think, lends itself to these long-term problems.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I just saw something. Oh, somebody's asking, like, can diet help at all with people trying to get off these medications? Specifically, the one that I recommend is like whole food plant-based.
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, first of all, if you look at people, if you look in support groups for people who've come off these things, right? Because they didn't get advice from their prescribers on how to come out for the longest time. And if you go into the support groups, a lot of them talk about diet and exercise. If you can get to a healthy gut, obviously that's good. We know that from history teaches us that. The history of medicine teaches us that a good gut is a one pathway to health. And also, just think about when you don't eat well, just for a second. If you drink coffee all day long, eat French fries and pizza, and you do that day after day, you generally don't feel so well after a while. So, I mean, I think the point is we know that good diet, a healthy diet is a pathway to health. And what you're really talking about here as you withdraw and all is trying to regain a certain sort of full body health. So yeah, I don't think we have as much research on this as we could use. But everything tells us in terms of common sense, and also what you hear from support groups and all, diet is really key.
Right. Angela wants to know if Zoloft taken for a few years could have permanently affected her sleep today.
You do hear complaints like that. Persistent insomnia, that it's throwing off your sleep-wake cycle and it's hard to restore. I mean, I know this from, I know a number of people who've started to have sleeping problems, and then they persist even after they come off, and they slept fine before. One of these questions is, so these, human beings all these neurotransmitters are interrelated, right? And they also go into the gut and all this sort of thing. And the brain's a mystery. Even the sleep-wake cycle is a bit of a mystery and stuff. And you're starting to disturb how the brain works. And here's what Stephen Hyman, the director of NIMH, said in 1996. All of these drugs perturb normal functions in the brain. In response to that perturbation, the brain undergoes a series of compensatory adaptations, trying to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium. And at the end of this compensatory process, the brain is now operating in a manner that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. That's what the director of the NIMH said in 1996. So given that the complexity of sleep and insomnia and all this, of course it can disrupt sleep cycles. And once you disrupt them, it's part of this trying to get back to a healthy state after you withdraw. So you can see all sorts of disruptions in life. If you've been on drugs for 3-4 years, just from what we know from people who've been in that experience, so many of them talk about disruptions in many domains of life for long periods of time afterwards. And insomnia is one of those things you hear people talk about.
People want to take these drugs. I mean, that's their right. I just wish that it would come with your book so that they could read your book and then make an informed decision whether or not the risk, cost benefit analysis. Because I never told you my story and why I was so interested is I had experienced the death of a child and I was given these drugs. I did not want to go on them. I was told they weren't addictive. I was given Lexapro because I developed panic disorder after her death. And once I got on them, I went through that. I could not get off of them. I mean, it was horrible. And it took 4 years in working with one of your biggest fans, Dr. Doug Lyle. And even then, it was the most horrible experience withdrawing from those drugs. And I did go slow. I was even given a pediatric liquid, to do it. But it still was such a nightmare. Going off the drugs was worse than the experience of having the reason to go on them. I mean, it really was a nightmare.
So, this is your story sort of tells of the tragedy that has been unfolding here. You took listen, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss of your child.
No, and it's fine. And the thing is I even said, are these drugs addictive? Because I don't even like to take anything. Right. I'm a person, I've been vegan for 45 years. I don't drink alcohol. I don't even I have to be in so much pain to even ask for something from the doctor. And even then it's I'm so afraid of drugs. And they said, oh, no. And they lie. Maybe they didn't know, but they were horrible. And also, yes, the drug made it so that I didn't have panic attacks because I really was not functional. I couldn't go to work, but I had no personality. Everything was flat. It was if you could see my office now, I live my life in living color. There's rainbows everywhere. And it was everything was gray. And it was just horrible.
Well, yeah, that's what a lot of people talk about, this dysphoria that develops on the drug. By the way, there's a research paper on this that said SSRIs may cause tardive dysphoria, what you're talking about. And then they say and you may not be able to get off the drug. It may be permanent.
And the only
That's-
reason I did that is because I didn't want to take benzos. I knew because I knew so many people that took like benzos a few times and couldn't get off. And I was given benzos for the panic attacks. And what I would do is I would take a Klonopin. It was the kind you put under your tongue, and I would like cut it in fourths. And if it was really bad, maybe take one. But I just didn't like the way benzos made me feel, because basically they would knock me out. Of course, if you're knocked out for 24 hours, you're not going to have a panic attack. But it's just, I just wish people would just, your book did not come out until 4 years after I was put on these drugs. And then immediately I was told to read the book. And I was angry when I read your book. I mean, not at you.
No, I know people feel betrayed, because listen, go back to what you said that's what I believe in, informed consent. People can do whatever they want. I mean, I don't care. But people should be able to be the authors of their own lives. And if they have the informed consent, they want to make the choice, that's fine. That's great. But it should be coming within informed consent. What does the research say about long-term outcomes? What does it say about getting off these drugs? What does it even really say about if you stay on the drug very long, you'll be this numbing sort of thing? Tell people that. But what I was going to say is, see how it converted you into a patient, so to speak, after a time where your life was dominated by the drugs at some point and coming off?
And I was excluded from getting health insurance because, like I have hypothyroidism and I take levothyroxine, but they'll still insure me, right? But when I was on those drugs, I couldn't even get insurance.
Wow, I didn't know. I mean, you hear all sorts of crazy insurance.
I mean, once they're off label, so what they did is they tried to give me like Prozac, which made me feel like I was going to jump off. These drugs are, I mean, from my perspective, they are horrible. Like you don't want to mess with your brain. Like, Robert, have you ever seen those? It's like a toy, and it's like plastic, and when you squeeze it, the eyes and the ears pop out. That's what it felt like coming off these drugs. Like literally, like my eyes were, I just remember they're laying in the dark, and my husband would be calling Dr. Lyle, it's not worth it.
We've had a lot of people write for us about what it's like to come off drugs, and the ones that were writing for us just describe this, not always, but with great regularity. It was so painful, so difficult.
This is my psych medicine.
Oh, you know what? Here's what I want I want a clinical trial that compares a drug to a dog, a loving dog.
And exercise. The other thing is exercise is the most underutilized antidepressant and anti-anxiety medicine. All these people I know that are on these drugs, they don't exercise at all. I mean, that's how Dr. Lyle got me to exercise. He says, that's your psych meds. And so every morning when I wake up, I spin at the highest level I can for an hour and drenched in sweat. And then that's my psych meds. And this one.
There's a lot.
This is my anti-anxiety medicine. Actually.
Well, they're the best. And I couldn't agree more with exercise. That's an obvious, all that data shows. In fact, there's a study that showed related to exercise, mood went up lockstep with your increase in your aerobic capacity. It was like they were tied. Aerobic capacity and depression were tied.
I laughed when you talked about medicating your wife because she was a bitch. I'm sure my husband would like to do that, because that's what happens on days I don't exercise. I really call it burning the bitch. I'm a different person, because once in a blue moon I have to miss because of an early morning appointment, and I'm like,
What's your dog's name?
Bailey. Bailey, this is Robert Whitaker. He's quite famous. She doesn't care.
I love it.
Anyway, I really think, what's next for you, Robert?
Well, this website, this web magazine has really taken over my life, because we now have affiliates in 10 other countries. So it's sort of like a growing movement of people trying to change things. So it really takes up my life. And I'm just trying to be a good grandfather. I love my grandkids. So
wow.
I would like to write a book again, get back to writing a book. It's just that this web magazine has taken over my life.
Yeah, well, maybe write one of success stories of people that escaped
Well, I do sometimes write about that on Mad in America. So we've written about things in Israel that are doing. We've written about things in Norway. So that's where I try to direct that writing interest now.
Yeah, well, I thank you for your work. And the thing is all the doctors that I work with that I admire the most, Dr. McDougall, Dr. Lyle, Dr. Goldhammer, for years, they have been telling everyone to read your book. And like I said, at the True North Health Center, where I often work, they actually sell your book. And the
That's
people
very nice.
in life that I respect the most, which are those three doctors, are all huge proponents of your work and
Well,
huge
tell them
fans.
all thank you for the
Yeah, I'm going to
support.
send them this interview. Are you kidding? I was so excited when they that you said yes. So thank you. And anytime you need a platform to talk about your work, and I started checking out Mad in America. Very, very nice, very interesting articles there.
All right. Well, AJ, it's been a real pleasure, and thanks for having
Hey,
me. I really enjoyed it.
thank you so much, Robert, and thanks to all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when my guest is Dr. Otto.